Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of the Conversation Capital with myself, Ursula Mariani, as your host and the voice of reason. Hi, girl. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Are you awesome?
I'm good.
How's your baby doing?
She's doing well.
You know what we chat about often?
Uh-huh.
We talk about culture and we talk about the influences of being in South Africa. The clip that went all over TikTok was me talking about how being in a racially charged country, I sometimes wonder how that affects how I see the world. And I made an example of going to Dubai and traveling with my sister who's from Malawi. And I immediately do the numbers. How many black people? How many, And then she said, why do you see life like that? And that really challenged me to think, how does culture and your upbringing and surrounding affect the lens in which you view the world? Are you really a global citizen or are you a South African citizen? You know what I mean? And so I said, you know what? Let's chat about this. Let's bring in experts in South African culture. And so I invited Mr. Donald Mokgale and Ernest Nkomotje. Hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you. How are
Doing
you?
really well.
Awesome.
Hi.
Why Oshema Donald for a greeting affirmation?
Thanks. so good to be here, guys.
Thank you so much. I know that you guys, have really done a lot of research with regards to South African culture and also just how businesses in South Africa can use South African culture to market correctly. Because sometimes certain marketing strategies won't work with the climate of South Africans or, the small nuances.
Yeah.
And so we've brought you in for that. But before we get into the topic of the day, if you guys could just share with us, who are you guys? Who's Donald? Who's Ernest? And
Okay. Now I'm a professional poet. That's Kidumilega poetry. I used to do a lot of poetry slams. I'm an entrepreneur. I've got 20 years in the media advertising industry. I've ran quite a few media buying agencies. So that's kind of where my kudogwa came. I was a writer, a performer. I did a little bit of theater work. In fact, your head of production here is a former poetry colleague of mine. So yeah, that's kind of who I am and my background.
Solid. Now I'm a professional philosopher, but also an entrepreneur as well. But also a subject matter expert in the world of research and insights. I met Donald years ago in the Adventist church.
Yeah. We're all laughing, guys, because Ursula had asked a question, so he answered it.
Yeah. I had asked if they were Adventists. Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, so we met years ago, and what began as a brotherhood in church evolved into a friendship and also a business partnership as well. We then also co-authored a book together, which I'm quite excited to talk to you guys about today.
What's the name of the book?
Introducing Hibirism, in the meantime, a guide to Black cultural nuance.
Hibiri, in the meantime.
Exactly.
Is it?
Inspired by that. Inspired by that. Yeah. So maybe let's talk you through that, right?
Yes.
As a starting point.
Yes.
Donald, perhaps let's start with issues of etymology and nomenclature. How do we stumble on this term called Hibirism? Where does it come from?
So Hibirism's root word is Hibiri from Sister Bettina's song, right? Which, as we know, became a social salutation. It kind of didn't really have a denotative definition. Hibiri, it's a thing you say at groove. It means YOLO. It means Areying. It means Habash. It means all of these things. But then with it lacking a clearer definition, we figured, you know what? Let's tap into something that's already in existence, something people are already somewhat familiar with, but there's no tight definition around it. It's loose enough that we can actually take it. So we took the small letter H, Hibiri, put a capital letter, added an ism at the end, and gave it a definition, which is now a noun. And that noun describes a lens through which to look at life. It's a problem-solving lens. It's a lens through which you can look at so many different things. So that's what Hibirism is. It's a perspective. It's like a set of binoculars you put on to see things clearer, to see things that are seemingly unconnected, so that you can see the connection actually inherent in them. That's what Hibirism is, and that's where the root word comes from.
Okay, so one of the connections that I made an example of earlier is me being in a foreign country, but me looking at things with the South African racial lens that we all have as South Africans.
Right.
So what are some of the other examples that you can say, as South Africans, these are some of the lenses that we look at
Sure.
things with, or when we have these binoculars on, these are some of the filters
Sure.
that we have, or some of our blind spots. If you could walk us through.
Sure. I think that the primary premise for us from which we operate from is the idea that there isn't much space for neutrality in society. Right? Everything always bears connotations in one form or the next. By neutrality, I even mean to imply that even as human beings, we can't be depoliticized. You're always living in a mode of being politically inclined or oriented. By this, I mean you're grappling with questions of what it means to be human and what does a life that is fully human entail? What should you have? What should you have access to, etc. Right. So as the primary premise that we operate from is this idea that there isn't such a thing as neutrality. I'll make an example. We've got a chapter in the book called We Need an Alternative Order of Symbols. And one of the arguments Donald and I were arguing in that chapter was to say that a notion of symbolic neutrality is also impossible. I mean, if you think about large brands, for example, fashion brands, they bear within them particular symbols. In the history of Black people in particular, some of those symbols have been anti-Black symbols, right? Encoded in the very texture and fabrics and connotatory logic of the fashion brands themselves. So that's one of the primary kind of ideas we have in Hibirism, that there isn't a space for neutrality much in society. Everything bears symbols and is always connotatively charged. And if that is the reality, you then have got an opportunity via a lens such as Hibirism to then look at ordinary everyday things, right? And begin to catch out what those symbols or connotations are. So in the same sense, Donald and I were able to look at a social salutation not really associated with much. I mean, Kharimba was saying Hebari initially, it evolves, it becomes Hibiri. And this social salutation then gets lodged in our collective kind of consciousness, right? In the same sense, we were able to look at that empty term, this empty signifier, if you will, and we were able to identify a moment of theory. Hibirism, as a lens, approaches social reality in that sense. It says that this notion of symbolic or existential neutrality is impossible, right? There's always opportunities for you to cash out hidden or latent meanings in things, right? So the book is then an odyssey and an expedition into us looking at ordinary everyday situations and things.
What is seeking?
A journey.
Askis.
No, I get salona ko khai.
It's a journey, right? So the book becomes a journey where we look at everyday things. I mean, we've got a book chapter called Room Dividers.
And other quintessential markers of blackness.
Rebuaka everyday objects that you'll see in a typical Black home, Gokasi, for example, right? Green bar soap.
Room divider. The blompoto. The glassware, the dog.
The dog. You gotta mention the dog. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the question then is, when you look at and you study these things, what do they mean for you as a Black person? But I'll get to that point a bit later in the conversation.
Yeah, I think one more example would probably be, there's a chapter called on Street Fighter, kites, and marbles. The chapter speaks about those analog games we used to play growing up and how those analog games taught us strategy. Because today in boardrooms, we're able to strategize because actually those were stratagem games themselves. Right? Like the marble, there was all about angles. You needed to choose whether you're knocking away your opponent from scoring or whether you're going to score. Right? So those are strategy, right? So we're connecting things like that to say the mindsets about tobacco guys who are now in boardrooms today, they have a lot to fall back on things that they are either aware or very inadvertent in their knowledge or consciousness of how those things were teaching them how to think, in those, various types of situations. So that's what Hibirism lens does. It finds connections and things that are, at least prima facie, at surface level seem very unconnected. And you don't really see the connection. And then we go, did you know these two things are connected in this way? I mean, we speak about Sigmund Freud in A Taxi Ride, you're going to go, what do you mean? And we speak about how Sigmund Freud, teaches you. So let me leave that for later.
Explain Sigmund Freud. Explained it in a taxi ride. It's got a shy, man.
Okay. So there's a chapter called Amapianoism. And that chapter specifically studies why is it that Amapiano blew up the way that it did. And we argue the history and that comes from Kwaito, it's the second version of Kwaito, all those things. But fundamentally, Sigmund Freud writes about the 5 stages of psychosexual development. And in one of those stages, he speaks about the phallic stage, where we are fascinated by our sexual organs, by sexuality in general, as we're discovering these aspects about ourselves. Now, the argument we're making is in the same way that Sigmund Freud identified the phallic stage, we as a society psychologically are in a perpetual phallic stage, because the music that we are blowing up in this particular way is music that only focuses on our base natures. Hogasheba, the fundamental subject line, Amapianoism and Amapiano and Kwaito is very much sex. It's hidden in sex, debauchery, drinking, being loose, very so we're arguing that that Sigmund Freud was identifying this very thing. So we see we're using theory to explain away a thing that is like, oh wow, I didn't notice. When Dr. Beleza sang that song, he was referring to something sexual. And so a lot of the big songs, it's very ratchet, sexually laden. It taps into the libidinal economy. So that's what I mean. Is we make connections of we clarify very dense theory and we show it in real life practical applications, everyday situations.
I'm going to take you guys back a bit.
Sure.
I don't know, which many people listening to this may be wondering as well. What is the gap that you guys identified to say we need a lens? Like, what was it? So an easy way of putting it is to say, what was the inspiration of coming up with this lens? I just want to understand what was happening. Happening?
So I think the biggest kind of gap Donald and I saw was that, let me begin in academic circles or spaces I used to exist in, right? So my biggest critique of the academy or universities or intellectuals that live in those spaces is that a lot of the stuff that they produce can be quite inaccessible to the everyday person, right? And the reality is that ideas and theories never for a theory unto itself. It must have a purpose, a telos, a teleology behind it, right? So think about the structure of revolutions, right? Ubiko, he died fighting. A man only dies fighting if he has really absorbed a very radical set of ideas, right? The history of the struggle movement as we know it in South Africa, even beyond just South Africa, you go to the diaspora as well. There's always a connection between knowledge and the desire for liberation. I think Paulo Freire makes a statement in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed that the concern for humanization leads us to an immediate recognition of dehumanization. In other words, the point he's making is that the subject who is fighting for liberation, for them to realize that they need to be free, they need to have studied their reality and existence. You know what? As umuntu, it's not ideal for me to be living this way, right? So there's then this connection and bridge between ideas at that level to say that once you then reach a particular level of consciousness, there's then a desire to use ideas to then change the face of reality. So my biggest critique for a very long time with academia is that a lot of the ideas generated in that space can be locked in just university spaces or amongst intellectuals, and it becomes a mere echo chamber. But I was part of Fees Must Fall, for example, and Rhodes Must Fall. The reason why you could have such a movement of such a scale is students had realized that knowledge has to live in a very concrete sense in society, right? Hence the agitations come, right? So part of the gap Donald and I saw was that we needed a way of distilling and condensing a lot of complex ideas that live in, academic textbooks. And for us, the lens of Hibirism was a step in that direction. We used both theory and humor to then give a critique and commentary around society. So that was the major opportunity for us, that how do you take complex ideas and represent them in a way in which any other person in society can begin to think about things that they never would have thought about before. I mean, the connections we make when we talk about, we've got a chapter on the politics of hair, from exfoliation to expropriation. We work on the issue of hair politics, as we know it in South Africa. And for us, the opportunity there was, you could actually make a comparative kind of juxtaposition between how weaves are stolen in Jozi CVD and the land question in South Africa. So we speak about expropriation of land, but we use as a metaphor the whole idea of weaves being expropriated from women's hairs in Johannesburg. So the main point I'm making here is that in the same sense, society doesn't allow for symbolic neutrality. There's always a space to attach symbols and bring out connotations in things. We also have an opportunity to ensure that theory comes alive in different ways. And one of the ways Donald and I have been attempting to do that was by consolidating this framework that we now call Hibirism. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. Okay.
I wanted to speak more now to the target market. You're speaking to the layman and really just interpreting things that they see every day and relating it to, some really big academic concepts, like you're saying, you know, look at Amapiano in a different way.
Yeah.
And so maybe if you guys can just walk us through, because you speak of using Hibirism as a lens for business people to be able to market correctly to South African individuals. But if you could also speak to us now, somebody else is like, hey, I want to understand what does it mean for me?
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying?
Completely.
So who is this book for?
This book is for everybody who wants to understand Black cultural nuance in South Africa and who wants to understand how to start viewing things differently, how to start seeing connections in their lives of things that are seemingly unconnected. It's a problem-solving lens for the everyday person as well. If you apply the lens of Hibirism, you're able to apply it in your own personal life, whether it's for relationships, for how do I make more money, how do I grow at work. The lens of Hibirism, in the way that I believe we've explained it in the book, is a lens that you can use to do all of those things. So the book's target audience is for anybody who's trying to understand the textures of what makes Mzansi what it is, where things come from, why Black people, for instance, behave the way they do. Where do those behaviors come from? We document a lot of things that are probably not new for most Black people, but we document them through the lens of Hibirism, and that's where the novelty comes in, is that we then make connections to things that they probably didn't think about. And they go, oh, I know we did that, but I didn't know that was the reason things came from. For instance, we talk about township spatial planning and how that affected the psychology of the majority Black people in the townships. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So, how the specific design of townships was done in low-scape environments, in places behind factories, so that the toxic waste can go to the township to affect the natality rates, right? Second thing was it was built in low-scape environment where there was no view of the horizon to prevent them from dreaming big. And so as a result of that, we find very typical archetypes of characters in the township, Mabanzula, then Mapujwa, Bomrepa, the Knoxman, or so there's these character archetypes that exist there. Then there's the intellectual, the one who's seen as yeah, you read. So there's these archetypes that exist in every single township in South Africa. So in the book, we explain these sort of phenomena and speak about where these characters come from. What are some of their social pressures? We even write about Bobby, the unsung hero, the dog, the township dog. So the book is for everybody. We speak to businesses to say, what do all these insights mean for your business? What do all these insights mean for product? What does it mean for marketing, for pricing, for so many things? So there's so many permutations and so whats that we unearth that are relevant for multiple people in different either businesses or even just society at large.
Okay, so let's leave the book. Let's talk about the archetypes. Tell us what are some of the insights that you've drawn from the book, without selling the whole book.
Yeah.
We still want people to buy the book, but just walk us through, what are some of these insights that you found?
Do you want to go?
Plenty interesting ones. We pull out, for example, in the space of kasi. We know abantu abamnyama stand in as well. The township is also known for gossip. Right?
The picture of ladies in gowns.
Exactly. Or 12. Namachita sitting outside with my friend Ispaza, right? And all you hear in a lot of those conversations is umkos. I get it. We're passing time, right? Because we're also dealing with the complexity of, being in those positions. But we pull out even the gossip mongers as a deep archetype, right? To say that there's a sense in which you can begin to look at the township space and realize it's actually rich with data, right? So there's certain data points you won't pick up from
quantitative data,
right? You need to venture to a level of actually talking to certain people for you to really understand the ins and outs of the kasi market, the kasi economy, and why it is that we somewhat resonate with certain things more than others. That's just one archetype we pull out. But there's always a so what in that sense. That's primarily the lens of Hibirism at play. It will look at something very ordinary. At first glance, right? But the minute you zoom closer into it, you begin to see these very interesting moments of insights.
So you are saying, from the lens of Hibirism, that group or whichever, whether it's guys sitting by a store or it's ladies by a corner gossiping, you are saying those people could be experts of that particular segment.
Absolutely. We're saying they're a powerful data source for what's going on in there. So, if you want to understand the comings and goings of people, what typically people buy, what kind of cars typically come here, when do they come here, there's a particular understanding of the township that they have that not many others have. So we're saying businesses guarantee you in your data sources he doesn't appear because you've never thought of him that way. You've never even considered him. Mamkopos that you were describing, Baba Riksamakwinya, Baba Dikaon, they're also powerful because they also understand certain aspects that the other one doesn't. That Noxmenta. Then Prabiza in the tavern also sees things that no one else sees. Are you with me? So there's these character archetypes that we can point to if you want. It depends what the job to be done is, right? So what are we looking for? Then we'll tell you who are the sources of data for that. So the point we're making is these would have never been identified as sources of data if it wasn't for the lens of Hibirism. And that's what it does. Is things that are very ordinary. And we see those guys all the time. Did you ever think of them as data sources?
Absolutely.
The Yentas. That's in a chapter called Daily Sons and Daughters, where we speak about how these character archetypes, these are the sources of news in a township.
I'm so interested to hear what are some of the insights you have around religion in the township. Because we know, it's common. What are some of the insights you guys found looking at life through the lens of Hibirism? Do you guys touch on religion in the township and what did it look like?
Yeah, so we've got a very beautiful chapter on.
They both got so excited.
Yeah,
that's how
typical Adventists.
It's. I think the style in which we grew intellectually is symmetrical to your typical ANC stalwarts. I mean, a lot of these guys come from mission schools, right? John Dube, even Ubiko is also a function of a mission school. So my intellectual genesis starts in the church. So it's always a exciting topic because I have a very sentimental connection to the church. But we've got a chapter called the Church as Seen by a Hibirist. It's actually a play on a chapter titled by Ubiko. He has a chapter called The Church as Seen by a Young Layman. So we then used a similar title, but the church is now seen by a Hibiris. And in that chapter, we talk about some of our experiences. I mean, I used to use the train a lot, the metro rail. And it's Zaki Bara because there's so much that happens in the train space. One of the things you'll find is not only is it a center of commercial activity where fruits, veggies are being sold or munyuteng series la, but there's also the church on wheels.
Yes.
Right. So when the blue collar workers board the train traveling back home, part of what they do is they engage in song. There'll be an individual usually preaching, but there's also the experience of people singing. And we thought about this Hibiristically, that what's actually going on here, right? And appealing to someone like Karl Marx, a German philosopher. Marx makes a statement that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, right? So, and in the Marxist kind of school of tradition, on the Marxian tradition, he makes the claim that religion, culture, ideology form part of what he calls a superstructure, right? So in Marxist theorization, you've got a substructure, which is the economic base, and then you've got a superstructure. What happens at the level of the superstructure, it's ideas or concepts that are generally generated or produced by those who own the means of production in order to pacify the workers. I'm giving a very sanitized, simplistic version of this
No,
thing.
and it's an important simplistic version, because I don't even know if it's simple enough, but it's a nice one. Yes, please continue.
Yeah, for context sake, right? So within the Marxist kind of reading and studying of reality, right, you've got this distinction between those who own the means of production and those who then work for those who own the means of production, right? So part of how those who own the bourgeois, who own the means of production, sustain the order in society is they give you this set of ideas, which is religion. I don't know if you remember Animal Farm, right? There was a particular character in the book, I think it's the raven, and the raven, which was the bird, would tell a particular story to the other animals, right? Squealer, I think, was one of the pigs.
The
but
pig.
Yeah, but he represented the media and the story narrative.
Yeah.
Okay, but
Right.
please continue.
But the idea, and Animal Farm is interesting because you've got multiple personas. One of them is a representation of the media apparatus. You've got Old Major, I think, who was this overly committed horse who would work himself to the bone.
Yeah.
Right. And then you've got the raven who would then come tell Old Major this story of this land oozing with milk and honey. Right. It sounds familiar, right? So as I was then as we would sit in the train, right, I would then realize that Christianity is actually quite predominant amongst us working class poor people. Why is that? Right. And if you think about it, it's a message of hope, right?
Yeah.
It's a message of existential deferment that life might be complex right now. We might be struggling right now, but we stand to have an opportunity of streets of gold. Right. So the book does then entail commentary around religion in that sense. And how we do it is then make connections, right? So in the same sense, we then used someone like Marx to at least look at the train situation, right? We then use other thinkers as well to then speak about the religious consciousness and the God thesis and the God idea. Not in a sense in which is hostile in any sense, but in a sense in which we are engaging and having a very frank conversation. The interesting thing is that the sense in which that one chapter is written, it is a position of one who's a skeptic and one who's an atheist, right? And where is the meeting point of these two people in their view and in their critique of religion?
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead with regards to what's written in the book, but my assumption, what you're saying is ideally people are on a train, they're off to a production site or they're off to whichever company they work for. And some of the feelings and emotions that they're going through are pacified by the man standing preaching. Is this where you guys are heading?
This is it.
It's part of it. Yes.
Careful now.
It's part of
Careful
it.
now.
No, we get deeper. It gets intense. We get into the black church.
Okay.
We get into so many things. Oh, I just don't want to give it away, but at the same time, what it is, very briefly, is we challenge the way we ought to be thinking about black church in the 21st century. Church, if you think about it as a structure, is that it's the one place where guaranteed there's a very high attendance rate by black people who are there specifically to listen very carefully to lessons that immediately change their lives. Okay, so we argue about hope being commoditized, and we critique that. We then argue about why is it that in spaces where you are there specifically to learn lessons, where you are giving your most amount of attention, you're not given the actual physical lessons that you can apply, not just spiritually, but tomorrow, just to change the way you think about savings, where you start having whales. Black people are the ones who've got the highest incidences of not even having whales. Have you seen the fights that happen at death, right? So why are those lessons not being taught there? Why are we not being taught how to save, how to invest, how to use this labor that we are so proudly using for the kingdom of God, but doing nothing to serve us here physically in the present? We critique that idea to say we're thinking about church seemingly in a very old-fashioned way. Not to say the spiritual aspects aren't important, but they are over-indexed against what is actually our primary things we need the most today, which is jobs, which is dignity, which is less violence, which is a safer society. We lack those things because we don't discuss them, because the church has got this archetypal approach of just preaching the word of God and give tithes and then bye-bye. So we critique a lot of that. And again, I don't want to give too much away, but the point I'm making is we start thinking about the black church in a very different way, to say, look, guys, if you have the kind of faith where you can drink petrol, where's that faith for us building a dream for somebody here who can change our lives? Where's that?
Penyo was here. What's his name? Penyo Mokgale was here. And I asked him, I said, do you think our reasoning that life will be better after death is the reason we navigate and move the way we move right now?
Yeah.
You know, and so I guess I'm posing the same question to you guys, because there's this thing about religion that it's okay. What you're going through right now is actually okay.
Sure.
But for me, there's value in it, in the sense that there's a lot of value, in the sense that these are the systems that got people through, right? If we look at even like slavery in America, you know, these are the church is what got people through.
Sure.
So I also don't want to be here and undermining the role of hope.
Absolutely.
Undermining the role of motivation, undermining the role, because you are in a system and you do need to get to the next place.
Yeah.
And you do need to move.
Yeah.
Because what happens, I remember when I went on my little religion, blah, 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 what happens is you lose hope. And you actually have nothing to live for.
Sure.
Then what are you guys doing as you two creating this void in us?
Sure.
Right? We're listening to you guys, and now you're saying, but that's where I'm receiving my hope.
Right.
That's where I'm receiving my motivation. What are you doing about my depression?
Sure, we got you.
Absolutely.
Got you.
No, you make a very valid point, right? You can't critique for the sake of critiquing, right? The point is to always elevate and educate, right? So I would make a distinction between you can't focus on good ways of still being wrong. Right?
Okay.
There's a point at which the conversation has to be about the truth. Right? So there's a sense in which, let me just touch on perhaps in the what we call the epistemology of beliefs. You can believe in certain things simply because those things work, right? It's a view we call pragmatism, right? So in other words, you hold on to an idea on the basis of the pragmatic, practical benefits it has. So I still believe, I still go to church because it gives me the hope or the dose of hope that I need, right? But there's a point at which you then have to make a distinction between things being of pragmatic value to you and things being true in themselves, right? And I think this is the ideal space every human being ought to play into, right? So a lot of the critiques we then give aren't meant to generate a vacuum and a void in individuals where you then sink into the sense of hopelessness and nihilism. I don't think that's a good and practical position for anyone to be in. The only point we're then making is that there's a sense in which you can think about your spirituality in ways that are more deep. I mean, think about it. The experience of the slaves in America, they were given a version of the Bible that focused solely on their position being ideally enslaved, right? A lot of chapters were even removed in many, and a lot of books in many instances were being removed. The verses that slave masters gave to them was ones that affirmed the fact that they needed to remain slaves, right? But they then began thinking about Christianity in a far more radical sense. Then you've got the Black theology kind of tradition. It comes out of liberation theology, a bit in South America, but you've got guys like James Cone, who then assembles and a few others, black theology, right? And if Stephen Bantu Biko actually borrows from Ukon and, he engages him at some level. And that moment becomes a very interesting
Tell
moment.
us about Cone and what he said. We don't know.
Okay. Oh, sorry. So Ukon was giving us the idea that there's a sense in which you can read the Bible, right? From an interpretatory style to your hermeneutics, where you begin to see it as a manual for your own liberation. So, for example, in the Old Testament, the book of Exodus talks about the Israelites being freed from the land of Egypt, right? So you could read that story resonantly in your position as a slave, as a black slave, right? Such that as you engage your religion at that level, right, you see liberatory potential.
As something for yourself.
As something for yourself.
Not something for the Israelites.
Exactly, right. So it moves from just being a story that's historically locked in the past to a story that has pragmatic value for us right here in the now. That how can I, and if you look at, for example, the origin of Negro spirituals, for example, it wasn't really something new, because even when the Israelites found themselves in captivity, you read this in the Psalms that by the rivers of Babylon we sat, we wept when we remembered Zion, right? So it is not in the slave moment where you see human beings singing to soothe the fact that they are slaves and, using the songs as a vehicle for liberation. It's always been there, right? So when Cone now enters the picture, and when a lot of black theologians enter the picture, the point is to say, how do you begin to study your own reality and you look at your religion in a very radical sense, in a sense in which you can begin to see the liberatory dimension to your religious manual, right? So we then, even the critique we give of Christianity isn't to say that, throw the baby out with the bathwater. It is to say that you ought to operate beyond a level of pragmatic value, right? It's also about true status. How valid and how true are a lot of these claims? But that's not a conversation I'm going to go into. But there's a sense in which you can study and look at your belief, right? And you're then able to then move yourself from point A to point B, as Donald is saying. You begin to critique even your own economic, financial position. And it no longer then says to you that it is okay to be poor because you're promised a mansion one day. It's saying that there's a sense in which you can live a fully dignified life on this side of history. So as well, yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment on that because I know it's just an off-ramp energy. The one thing that's quite sad about religion also is that conclusions drawn to say, okay, this is what religion is and this is what religion does, often happen mainly because a lot of people study what is available to them and draw the conclusions from there. Like, for example, the fact that we see religion as something that people follow religion, but religion doesn't pull us into a place of wealth, right? That's because that's where we come from. Like, we don't see, it's what we're exposed to. It's how church was built in the spaces that we come from. Like, the reason I say that is if you go back and, for example, look at the Salvation Army, like just do research on the Salvation Army. There was a point in time where the Salvation Army, the women, right, they got together and they would look at a newspaper during, I think there was like a very bad, call it a depression or recession. And they would literally sit and organize themselves, which is why they call themselves an army, because they organize themselves as such. So they would look, okay, there's a child born here. Now keep in mind that even the government is struggling to keep people fed. And they would literally sit and say, there's a child born in this hospital. They'd organize themselves and knit. And then there would be those who deliver. Hand over the clothes to them, they go to that hospital and they deliver the clothes there. And they would do that with food, with clothes, for babies. And they were doing so much that they ended up outgiving the government to the people around their area, right? And that's how the Salvation Army eventually, even because of how well they organized themselves in doing things for people, they even spread out of America. I think they started in Azusa Street, if I remember correctly, right? And then here's another one that I've been looking into quite a lot. There's a lot of examples that I could use throughout the church's history, but it does really depend on what you're exposed to, because not a lot of people even know about Azusa Street. Not a lot of people even know about Salvation Army and what did the Salvation Army do and why they spread and what was so amazing about them. Another thing that I look at that's a bit closer to home, and I know that every time I talk about this, it kind of leaves a little bit of a bitter taste, because it sounds like I'm saying abelungu bangcono, essentially. But the point I'm getting at is, do you know how many Afrikaans churches have schools on the church campus? Like, for them, it's a norm, guys. Churches back home, places where I've traveled around around our country, when I say South Africa, like places here in Gauteng, it's a norm. Like, they don't even second guess it. If they're going to build a church, there's so many private schools that were actually built by pastors, or someone who works a professional job, is a minister or church leader, and then they built a private school. For them, that's like a norm. It's like, I don't know if I could call it a cultural thing within them, right? It's Tina, we just didn't have that. I don't know, what can I call it, the thing that we lacked, where we are
sorry.
No problem.
Please finish.
Yeah, so I feel like we are in, which I've mentioned before, like with the pastor that I used to go to back home, Ewelas. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Ewelas. Like, those are usually the places in Lokshini that we refer to as Ewelas. Those are usually the places that are most impoverished, right? And then you'll get pastors who are used to the way church is. I don't know how I should really phrase that. You understand how church, so they build church and then they preach messages of mele uliviana, then, I mean, I went to a church where literally that was the message. Like, I'm not even joking. Like, mele bodli rashen, where's umsalone a bodli rashen. You know what I mean? And at that time, you have a church where we've built the main church, but no one is talking about building a computer center. No one is talking about and I've seen, Guti, I don't know if I can say, Guti, maybe the culture is wrong, or the practice is wrong, or the way that church was introduced to us. Guti, church only serves this function, nothing beyond that. But for other cultures, even Muslims, their religion, they understand themselves. Guti, our religion is tied to our culture, it's tied to our finances. There are countries where Muslim countries where debt is not a thing. Like, the bank partners with you, they don't loan you money.
Sure.
I think it speaks to what Ernest was when he opened up to say, how the slave master introduces the religion, and that's the confines that it needs to keep you in, that it doesn't allow you to think. But we're getting to a place where people are thinking outside the box. And I like the example that you're making, given around white churches, because I go to a church that's predominantly led, and it was the first time where I was getting to a church where there's biz plenaries, and the ideas that you're supposed to network, and people are discussing business, and of course everything's still within the mandate of what we're here for. So kingdom related business, and not just kingdom related business, but how you can use business and your business acumen to forward the kingdom. That's how they put it. But that's something I had never heard of in the black churches that I grew up in, and just seeing the difference. I remember the closest thing that maybe came to something like that was a career day yabana baskolo. That was sort of the closest thing. Once again, though, teaching you how to be a slave, teaching you how to enter into the work environment. Slave is a bit of a tough word, but it's the word for now that we can apply now, because modern day slavery. And so we don't have a lot of time left. Are you guys done chatting about religion? Because I want to ask about one more element.
I think
it's a touchy one. But you guys did a good job.
Thank you.
Yeah, you did a good job.
I hope we did enough to tease the thinking that, like they said, there's a lot of critical thinking that went behind it, and we provoke a lot of thought, and we challenge a couple of things.
I want to look at one more element of your book.
Sure.
Right. I want to hear your thoughts around, using Hibirism lens to look at romance in Sawa, in Cholo. The pandemic. Let's go.
There's so much that we touched on, but to look at the lens, or rather to look at Umjolo from the lens of Hibirism, we go deep in the book. So Hibirism in this particular context will speak about knowledge of self. That's where it starts, right? Whether you are grounded in religion, grounded in spirituality, all of it dictates and demands that you know yourself in order for you to thrive on this earth. So Hibirism as a starting point it's pro knowledge of self and continuous improvement of the self. So there's a constant studying, a constant sharpening. So the lens of Hibirism is all about existential excellence, right? So when it comes to Mjolo, for us, this is a fundamental. You have to be striving for existential excellence already on your own, right? On your own, you have to be working on yourself. You have to be, I don't want to over-index therapy because I can see 21st century is overdoing it, right? People, they get a bit stressed. They say that work is toxic, and it's just like, calm down. It's work. So what I'm saying is, though, healing traumas, right? Healing traumas and understanding boundaries, triggers, and again, not to overhype the over psychology, the using too much psychological lingo and jargon like narcissism. Now that a few people have learned the word, oh my God, I've heard it the most in this last 24 months. It's ridiculous. But the point I'm making is, it's really just being the best version of yourself and consistently striving to be. That's the starting point. And so the commentary you make in the book, there's a chapter called From the Woes to the Woes of Wooing. We speak about Ukshela, right? That thing is a dead art, and it's a dead art because it's killed by multiple factors. One of them is the economy and the commoditization of the man's love, the lack of appreciation for the art of wooing. It's dead now. Like you're corny if you do that today. The fact that man's value has been limited to being a wallet. There's a whole host of factors that we speak about, and similarly, women are just been reduced to just the behind and so on and so. So but a lot of these are not new behaviors. They're just taking slightly different shape, and they've been accelerated, exacerbated by technology, social media. So we speak about how wooing is a dead art fundamentally, and how, because of a lack of knowledge, a lack of self-actualization from majority of today's society, that is the fundamental trigger for why Umjolo is as toxic as it's become today. So those are some of the factors that we touch on.
Yeah, we talk about sex as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, you see.
So just so just to build on that chapter on Ugushela, which is a very beautiful chapter. I mean, we grew up in the era of love candies. You'd give a girl a love candy.
And it meant something.
It meant something. You'd write her a letter, but you do that later, it's like, what's wrong with this guy, bro? So we've got a chapter on making each other orgasm as patriotic, right? So we start the chapter talking about wars in society. I mean, I know things are going on in the world currently, but the whole idea of troops being sent out to defend the country, right? It's considered to be an act of patriotism or service to your country, right? So we use that as a bit of a metaphor to then speak about sexual relations in the country, that there's a sense in which you can study sexuality even at an economic level. We're being playful here, right? We come up with a notion we call gross domestic orgasm, right? Which is a proxy of gross domestic product, which is used in economic circles to speak to the productivity and how wealthy essentially a country is. So we talk about gross domestic orgasm, which is essentially the amount of orgasms being had or achieved in a particular country, right? And then we make a connection between satisfaction and productivity levels, right? So we're very playful in that chapter, and the kind of claim we're making there is that, us being sexual creatures and done rightly, right? People go to work in good moods, smiling. Umareki in finance is not giving you attitude anymore. Partially because of Ufriki managed to do the things, right? He did the freaky things to her, right? So the book has an ability to speak to everything in that sense, right? In the same sense, we talk about the art of wooing or ukshela. We then speak about sexuality at that level, to say that there's a sense in which even sex is good for our satisfaction levels, which is good for our productivity levels, which is also good for our gross domestic orgasm as a country, which is a concept that we come up with in Hibirism. So Hibirism then is playful in that sense. We come up with a lot of novel ideas, right? We look at very ordinary things and say, how can we talk about this thing in a manner and sense that's very playful?
I like what you're bringing up around the idea of Ukshela and how it's a dead art. I'm thinking about, imagine on Valentine's Day, you get a letter. Is that an easy thing to brag about on social media? Like you got a letter and then?
Oh yeah, it's as if it's a build-up.
No, as you said it, I really thought, this is really just the truth. Just somebody writing you a love letter, it's a dead art. You know, where somebody else actually, I know for me, words of affirmation is it. Like I always sing shaya, right? But it won't be easy for me to brag about that to my friends because that's how much, you know, we've really centered these things around things that don't even really necessarily matter to you, but they matter to, you know, the world and roses. Because roses on Valentine's Day are 1,500. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what you want to see. You know, that's what you want to display. You forget Ronaldo sinus. Roses don't sit so well with your sinus. You get what I'm saying, right? And something that would really have much value to you, like a letter, you know, it's something that you can't brag about. And that's where this, you know, it's become such a dead art. I love that perspective. Wow, that was beautiful.
Thank you.
Guys, any parting shots, any parting questions?
Something that I'm thinking of when you guys are talking about all of the things that we ignore and don't realize that they're, let me say, data points, but also that we can learn a lot from those things, even though they happen in the background of society, right? Okay. I'm thinking about how, when you were talking about Street Fighter, I'm thinking about research that was actually done on first-person shooter games. So your Call of Duty, Battlefield, etc., etc. There's a study that was done that actually found Uguti people who play first-person shooter games are better drivers. So it also shows Uguti, and this is done in the West, right? Because it also shows Uguti Nati, some of the games that we play, very practical games, some we grew up with, we take for granted what skills are they building, whether it's skills to socialize, like umkoqiso, guys, umkoqiso, storytelling, like that's, and I look at my daughter, we're looking at her drawing something at home and it looked like ufuna ukudlala umkoqiso, but she's obviously, she has no context of it, like she doesn't know what that is. And I was literally thinking to myself, good, I wonder what skill we learned from that.
Think about this, the resourcefulness of black women, right? The fact that you could take umkusha, which is stockings, and repurpose it to create a harness, right? So that you could play a game of that nature. That level of ingenuity that black women have, stretching resources, you know, being good with finances, shaping you up as a man, is stuff that was baked in from, of course, some of the games do have to be critiqued. I mean, we used to play Umama no Baba. Growing up, which was very problematic because the kind of stereotypes that were then reinforced. That they
so shy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Hey, like
I've
never literally thought of these games we used to play in that way, right? Another thing I was thinking of, which definitely a question I wanted to ask, or just to get your thoughts on it, or even just to make it more practical for the viewer, right? Now I'm looking at the workspaces that we work at, right? And all the challenges, we're very multiracial. A lot of the companies owned by white people, a lot of them sitting on the board and making the final decisions. And I'm thinking about how, I mean, the market for most products being sold in the country, black. The markets are black, right?
Sure.
Whether you're selling to a Ursula who's living in an urban area, or you're selling to someone who's living in a more rural context. Because another thing that crossed my mind earlier was thinking about the taxi drivers. Taxi drivers are, I mean, there's so many things I don't like about taxi drivers in South Africa.
Same, bro.
Just the taxi industry. But there's just something about how they pick their routes. They don't do any market research. Like how they decide which route is the most profitable one. They don't have any books that they keep.
Right.
but the money must be delivered. I know Guti, by the end of the day I'll have this much. I know the depreciation on the vehicle that I need to take care of. I know how many years it's gonna last me. They literally finance their vehicles and they already know Guti, I'm gonna finish paying off this vehicle after this long, right?
Security around because they're dealing with cash.
Yes.
But you hardly hear of them getting robbed.
Exactly.
It's a whole organized. I love it.
Like those things are things that we don't really think about, right? So now I'm thinking about practically in the workplace. Like let's take like the average person who works a 9 to 5. What are some of the problems that Hibirism would be able to solve, right? There's an example that I like to use that a friend of mine told me about where she used to work. They were trying to do a campaign that was clearly targeted at black people, but the people making the decisions were white folks, right? Where they took something like, they know Guti, we like 7 colors, but now they took 7. So imagine beetroot, imagine mazambane, and then it's sort of like shaped. It's a trifle, I think they call it, or some kind of. They're stacking it on top of each other, and then it must look like some kind of ice cream sundae. Marama Vechi, who would look at that and think, that looks like something I'd like to support. And she was working for a very prominent brand, a very prominent brand in the country, right? And it really makes you realize, Guti, there are so many things. And another example I could use where I used to work when I was in the car sales industry, where you'd literally see black people walk into the dealership and try their best to not be approached by a white person. Right, and then when they're now sitting with the white person, they'll look at you, the black person, would, you know what I mean? But these are the nuances, because also there are certain things where we would discuss this in meetings where we would tell them, good, okay, these are the things that you don't realize you're not communicating or you're not doing. Like, for example, when you're speaking to a black elderly person, you don't look at them in the eye. The reason you don't get sales is because you intimidate them, because you come strong, confident, you have a firm handshake, and you look at them straight in the eye, whereas that's not what we do. We're like, sawubona mama. Kunjani baba, we siyazithoba, we don't intimidate them. So I'm wondering if what does Hibirism look like in solving those everyday problems that we see in our 9 to 5s?
Sure, it'll vary depending on the exact nature of the problem, but seeing that we focus predominantly on black cultural nuance, one of the funniest memes that we use as a trope to explain these things is to say, I'll usually will bring in a Zulu speaker, and then I'll bring in the people I'm trying to educate about the cultural nuances, and just to show the depth and texture of the nuances, I'm going to, and I need you to help do this with me, right? I'm going to say this sentence in English, and I need you to translate it back in isiZulu, okay? Since it's obviously very common. Given, listen here, don't sleep here, sleep over there.
Given, lalela la, ungalali la le, or la le, la
you said it right.
La le, la le.
I love that.
Right. Yeah. And now, if you were to write what you just said, how do you think a non-Zulu speaking person would have read that? Right? Because it's la 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 la. What's going on? You don't know where the intonation is. You don't know how to. So in the same way, that sentence alone has got that level of nuance and complexity, is the same way we ought to approach one another's cultures. And that's how I land the point in mostly, kind of, let's call it Eurocentric spaces, where that texture and that nuance will always be lost, because where else can they learn it? Because in St. David's, they're not going to learn that, right? But in being with black people, who speak the language, they'll be able to be exposed. So there's a lot of people who aren't exposed to that level of nuance. So there's various ways. The point I'm making here is I would do that in a presentation form, in the office, to really land this singular point that this is how complex cultural nuance can get. So if you get it wrong, you can really offend and you tank the business or the product or the investment, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, I had a colleague once who struggled to communicate the fact that they had the calling, and there are moments when they are bombarded by certain experiences, right? So, and I remember having the chat with him that it would be so hard for you to land that point to people who don't come from where we come from. Because it's a norm to us, right? So that's one of the complexities then Hibirism would try help solve, or at least put people in a better position to communicate. That how do you, at the level of human capital strategy and HR strategy, embed policies and sensitivities that then allow you to see that people are actually different. It's a bit of a rabbit hole, but Hibirism ultimately is saying that each individual and each culture has its own complexities and nuances, right? And you can begin to communicate those complexities to those who don't come from your background via this lens. And that's why we went for the humor route. It wasn't us just being jocular or funny. The point was to say there's some hard stuff that we also want to communicate. And then we used humor as a vehicle to try get some of those points across. The reason why we don't always open windows in taxis, the reason why it's because part of our psychological makeup, from where we come from and the experience and the relationship we share with space, amongst other things. Another person would just simply say that blacks are just being ignorant for not doing that. But you kind of have to understand where some of these behaviors actually stem from. It then puts you in a position of empathy to say that I kind of understand certain things because they are, a function of a certain set of reasons.
I think it's amazing what you guys are doing. I remember when we first interacted, I found that it's a school of thought or a lens that people can use to understand particular things. And as I listen to you guys speak and explain certain things, I feel like people feel seen.
Yes.
You're explaining things that would often be overlooked. Some of them are so simplistic that you're thinking, guys, what are you doing? Right? But the truth is, for white people, for the lack of a better word, they have a lot of their things explained, and black people don't. It feels like when it started, it feels like almost you're decolonizing or demystifying a lot of things for black people.
Sure.
So I think it's really awesome. You bring it to the academy, which may be difficult for a lot of people to get, but I think it's important work.
Thank you, Bonga.
I'm thinking of giving the example around a salesperson being able to understand the black client, and that's why I think outside of the fact that a lot of black people, there's a lot of black people in South Africa, black people make better salespeople because they know how to sell to black people. Right. So they might not necessarily be sitting in the boardrooms. I'm thinking about, I worked at a retail store, this huge retail store that sells the hi-fi machines, the sound system. The sound system, the TV. And every Sunday, the black salespeople would play a very Eddie Zone. Yes. And it attracted the store because most of the people in the store at the end of the day, they're South Africans and they understand. Hi, Blasaji.
Sundays are for lovers.
Sundays for lovers.
Word.
And they knew how to relay that information. Whereas the white guy on cameraman duty wouldn't know what to blast. Whitney Houston, I'll make love to you. It's a Sunday, and really just being able to translate that information because it's black people dealing and selling to black people. So that was a really lovely example. Great work that you're doing. Any closing, parting shots that you want to leave us with before we close the show?
I think, firstly, thank you for inviting us and having this conversation with us. We're really appreciative of the opportunity. And secondly, I think it's been a phenomenal journey writing the book. And it's obviously volume 1. There's many other plans to turn it into a documentary series and so on and so forth. So there's so much that we plan on doing. And I hope that the people of South Africa, both the business audiences as well as just the general population, can get a copy and really start thinking about themselves differently. Because I think that the lens of Hibirism really has so much value to add in both the personal and professional lives of people, and we're hoping that in this work, we finally found vocabulary and lexicon that articulates things that we've always known, man, always seen, always interacted with, but never really had the full language of explaining it. That's what we do in the book. And we hope that people can use that to, to really just further themselves and continue to pursue this existential excellence that I think we ought to all be pursuing. But thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Yeah. Shout out to Conversation Capital, phenomenal host, voice of reason, head of production. Thank you so much for having us here. It's been an absolute joy talking about all things Hibirism and just the human and the Black experience.
I think we already have one Hibirist.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely. So a lot more hopefully in the comments. Yeah.
Amazing.
That was today's episode of the Conversation Capital. I think the book description given say something here. It'll be in the link how to get the book and blah 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 blah. But don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and comment. What are some of the nuances you've seen? We've tried to come up with a few examples as to how to look at Black culture, how to look at yourself, where you come from, and how this influences how you see the world and how you buy things and things like that. So if you've got a few examples, please make sure to leave it in the comment section. For now, though, goodbye and God bless.